Okay, so today we're going deep, really deep, into the mind of a philosopher who always seems to get people riled up, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah, he's a big name, that's for sure. A real heavyweight in philosophy, and he definitely wasn't afraid to shake things up.
Right. Not afraid at all to kind of poke at those sacred cows.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at Nietzsche through the lens of H.L. Mencken, who wrote about him in the early 20th century.
And Mencken's work is particularly interesting, I think, because he was really trying to make Nietzsche accessible to an English-speaking audience. People who maybe didn't have a background in German philosophy or all that dense academic jargon.
Yeah, it's like he was trying to translate not just the language, but the whole way of thinking. So kind of like a philosophical translator almost, trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to bridge that gap.
Okay.
And it's important to note, too, that Mencken himself later acknowledged that our understanding of Nietzsche has continued to evolve. I mean, there are new translations, new scholarship, all that. So things have shifted.
For sure, it's an ongoing process, right? Understanding a thinker like Nietzsche.
Absolutely. But our mission today is to try to pull out those key, impactful insights from Nietzsche's philosophy. The ideas that really make you stop and think, maybe reevaluate some things, the things that offer a surprising perspective on morality, on society, on what it means to be a person in the world.
Yeah, I think those are the ideas that really stick with you, the ones that make you question things. And that's what we're aiming for today, to get you up to speed quickly but thoroughly.
Exactly. Get those gears turning, hopefully spark some aha moments along the way.
Mm. So Nietzsche didn't just come out of nowhere, right? I mean, he didn't develop his ideas in a vacuum. There were a lot of thinkers who influenced him.
Oh, tons. Mencken actually lists a whole bunch of different influences. We're talking Goethe, Schopenhauer,
Mhm.
those ancient Greeks like Heraclitus, even Darwin, Stendhal, Stirner, Hobbes. It's a really diverse group. It's like a who's who of intellectual heavy hitters.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how different people emphasize different parts of that lineage, right?
Yeah.
Like who they see as the most important influences.
Right. It depends on who's doing the interpreting, what they're focusing on. But one figure who Mencken really highlights as a significant early influence is Arthur Schopenhauer.
Especially Schopenhauer's book, The World as Will and Representation, right?
Yeah.
Apparently, Nietzsche felt a really strong connection to it right away.
Yeah, really strong connection. And what's fascinating is that Schopenhauer's whole philosophy revolved around this idea of the will, this kind of blind, irrational force that's driving everything.
And he believed that the path to peace was through renunciation, like escaping the grip of this will.
Yeah.
And initially, Nietzsche was really drawn to that idea.
Yeah, he really was. Mencken even quotes Nietzsche saying something like, every line of Schopenhauer's book clamored for renunciation, negation, resignation.
Wow, that's pretty bleak, isn't it?
It is. But as we know, Nietzsche didn't exactly become Mr. Resignation.
No, not at all. In fact, Mencken calls him a prophet of defiance, which is, well, a bit of a different vibe. So what happened? What caused that shift?
Well, while Schopenhauer definitely provided an initial framework, Nietzsche ultimately took a very different path.
Yeah, like he took that concept of the will, but then steered it in a whole new direction.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, you have the influence of Darwin's theory of evolution, which was a huge intellectual development at the time.
And Mencken talks about Nietzsche's complex relationship with Darwin, because he wasn't just a straightforward Darwinian.
No, not at all. He definitely had his criticisms, but at the same time, that fundamental idea of humans as biological beings, as part of the animal kingdom, that really resonated with him.
Yeah, so it's like he was pushing back against Darwin in some ways, but also absorbing some of those core concepts.
Right. He wasn't just accepting Darwinism whole cloth, but it definitely influenced his thinking about human nature and about, that constant struggle for existence that Darwin talked about.
That's a great point. And Mencken also mentions Max Stirner, who was all about individual liberation, right? And it's interesting to think about how that emphasis on radical individualism might have shaped some of Nietzsche's later ideas, especially his ideas about self-overcoming.
Yeah, it's definitely worth considering. I mean, there's a clear connection there. So yeah, Nietzsche was engaging with a really wide range of ideas, and it all kind of swirled together in his philosophy.
A real melting pot. Okay, let's talk about one of Nietzsche's more, well, striking concepts, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Can you give us a quick rundown of what those terms mean?
Sure. Think of them as two fundamental but contrasting forces that Nietzsche saw as central to ancient Greek culture, particularly in Greek tragedy. And he named these forces after the Greek gods, Apollo and Dionysus.
Apollo, the god of art, order, and contemplation. And Dionysus, the god of, well, life, chaos, and instinct. It's Pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, a real dichotomy. And Mencken uses a great analogy to illustrate the difference, actually. He talks about Rudyard Kipling's poem, where Kipling compares himself, the writer, to an artist named Zogbaum and to Admiral Evans, who is this real man of action.
It's a great analogy because it really highlights that difference between observing and representing life through art, which is more Apollonian, and actually living it, experiencing it fully, which is more Dionysian.
Exactly. So the artists, like Zogbaum or Kipling, they're capturing life, giving it form. And Admiral Evans, he's out there in the thick of it. He's embodying that Dionysian energy. And Nietzsche saw different art forms as leaning towards one side or the other. So, for example, epic poetry, sculpture, painting, those were more Apollonian, more about shaping and recording reality.
Right, like capturing a moment in time, imposing order on it.
Yeah. While things like dance, music, dramatic festivals, those were more Dionysian. They were more about expressing that raw, vibrant energy of life itself, that kind of chaotic energy.
And for Nietzsche, Greek tragedy wasn't just some sad story. It was this incredible result of the tension and the interplay between these two forces.
Right, Mencken really emphasizes that. The power of Greek tragedy for Nietzsche came from that struggle between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, between form and chaos.
And he believed that a balance between the two was essential for a healthy culture.
Absolutely. He thought that too much of one or the other would lead to problems. Too much Apollonian, and you get stagnation. A culture that's too rigid, too obsessed with form, and lacking vitality.
And too much Dionysian.
Too much Dionysian, and you risk descending into barbarity. A purely chaotic existence without any structure or meaning.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance, which is, something that every culture struggles with.
It's a constant tension, yeah. Okay, let's move on to something that Nietzsche is maybe most famous for, or infamous for, depending on who you ask.
His radical rejection of traditional morality. This is where things tend to get really interesting.
And a little uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. So what was Nietzsche's big issue with traditional morality?
Well, he argued that moral codes are not, divinely inspired or universally true. They're not handed down from some higher power. Instead, he saw them as arising from very practical concerns, from the instinctive desire of a particular group of people to live under conditions that best served their well-being.
So, morality is about survival, basically. What works best for a particular group in a particular time and place.
Yeah, essentially. And Mencken gives the example of Egyptian morality versus Goth morality.
Oh, that's a good one. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So Nietzsche's point was that the environment, the challenges, the whole context that the ancient Egyptians lived in shaped their morality. So living along the Nile, developing this complex agricultural society, they needed a moral code that valued order, stability, maybe even a strong priestly class.
Right, because those things would have helped them thrive in that specific environment.
Exactly. But the Goths, on the other hand, they were more nomadic, more warrior-based. So they had different needs, and that led to a different set of values. Things like strength, courage, loyalty to the tribe. The morality of each group, in Nietzsche's view, was really just their instinct for survival playing out in different ways.
That's a fascinating way to look at it.
Yeah.
So what about the role of the gods in all this?
Well, Nietzsche wasn't exactly known for his religious piety.
Right. Understatement of the year.
He argued that these instincts, these moral codes, were often attributed to gods to give them authority, to make them seem permanent and unquestionable. So what was once just a way for a group to survive became the sacred law.
And that made it harder to change, to adapt as conditions change.
Exactly. And Nietzsche saw that as a problem, as holding us back. He thought that clinging rigidly to outdated moral systems would stifle progress and prevent individual development, because what worked for one group at one time might not work for another group later on.
Which brings us to his concepts of slave morality and master morality, which are, pretty loaded terms. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So slave morality, which Nietzsche largely associated with Judeo-Christian values, is a morality that emphasizes things like self-denial, humility, pity, and resentment towards those in power. It's a morality that, in his view, arises among the oppressed.
And master morality is kind of the opposite.
Yeah, it's more assertive. It values things like pride, strength, nobility. It's about creating your own values, not just accepting the values of those in power. It's about self-affirmation, not self-denial.
And Nietzsche had some, well, pretty controversial views on exploitation.
Yeah, he did. He argued pretty bluntly that life is fundamentally exploitation, that the strong will always, when they can, exploit the weak.
Not exactly a feel-good message.
No, not at all. He saw it as a natural, unavoidable part of the struggle for existence. And Mencken quotes Nietzsche saying something like, "The gain of one man is inevitably the loss of another." So there's this inherent competition that he saw as woven into the fabric of life.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the Übermensch. Another one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but often misunderstood. What did Nietzsche mean by the Overman, or Superman?
So the Übermensch is Nietzsche's ideal. It's an individual who has overcome nihilism. And by nihilism, he means that sense that life has no objective meaning, value, or truth.
So it's about confronting that sense of meaninglessness and then creating your own meaning.
Yeah, exactly. It's about self-mastery, about living life affirmatively, embracing the challenges, and becoming the most complete, self-actualized version of yourself.
So it's not just about power in a crude sense, like being a dictator or something.
Right. It's not about dominating others, it's about mastering yourself. But Nietzsche also had some controversial ideas about aristocracy and the role of the masses.
Yeah, he did. Mencken points out Nietzsche's belief that a healthy aristocracy would essentially see the masses as tools for their own advancement, like they would be willing to sacrifice individuals for the perceived benefit of a more select group.
And that's obviously a really tough idea for modern sensibilities. But it's important to understand it within the context of Nietzsche's critique of egalitarianism. He believed that constantly trying to level everyone down, trying to uplift the weak, would ultimately hinder the progress of the strong and the overall potential of humanity.
And the concept of self-love played a big role in his thinking, too, right?
Absolutely. Mencken quotes Zarathustra saying that you must learn to love yourself with a whole and healthy love. And Nietzsche saw that as a prerequisite for really living a fulfilling life. He sometimes viewed that emphasis on loving thy neighbor as a distraction from that essential self-acceptance.
Okay, let's try to unpack the will to power, which is another one of those Nietzschean ideas that gets thrown around a lot and often misinterpreted.
Right. It's often seen as this crude desire for domination, but Mencken explains it as something much more nuanced.
Yeah, he says it's about a fundamental drive for growth, for self-overcoming, for embracing life in all its aspects.
The good and the bad, the joyful and the painful. It's that force within us that pushes us to become more, to expand our capabilities, to master challenges.
And Mencken even suggests that Nietzsche saw the pursuit of truth as part of this will to power. Like that drive for accurate understanding, for uncovering uncomfortable truths, is all part of that same fundamental drive.
Okay, this is where things get really trippy. Let's talk about the eternal recurrence. What's the basic idea here?
So the eternal recurrence is the idea that every single event in your life, down to the tiniest detail, will repeat itself infinitely, in the exact same sequence forever.
That's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. And Mencken stresses that Nietzsche didn't present this as a scientific fact, but more as a philosophical thought experiment.
But it's a thought experiment with huge implications. Oh, absolutely. Mencken describes how Zarathustra, Nietzsche's fictional prophet, is almost driven to despair when he first encounters this idea, because it forces you to confront this really profound question. If you knew for certain that you would have to live this exact life with all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and failures over and over again for eternity, how would that change how you live it right now?
Yeah, it really forces you to examine whether you're living authentically, whether you truly value your life as it is.
Right. It's a call for radical self-affirmation, for taking responsibility for every single moment. Okay, Nietzsche was also a pretty harsh critic of education and academia in his time.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly a fan of the establishment.
Not at all. Mencken describes how Nietzsche saw education as failing to cultivate independent thinking. He thought it was more about promoting conformity and just accepting authority without question. And he worded that teachers themselves were often unoriginal, stuck in their ways, just regurgitating dogma.
And he even suggested getting rid of government funding for philosophers, which is a pretty radical idea.
He did. And his argument was that true philosophical progress, that real groundbreaking thinking, requires independence. He thought that chasing after comfortable academic positions and state-sponsored salaries would stifle genuine inquiry.
Now, we're looking at Nietzsche through Mencken's lens, but we can't ignore the fact that Nietzsche's views on women and marriage are really controversial. And, to be honest, pretty problematic by today's standards.
Yeah, and Mencken touches on this. He mentions that Nietzsche generally agreed with some of Schopenhauer's ideas about women, which were, well, Pretty negative and limited.
Definitely not something we'd endorse today.
No, not at all. But it is important to acknowledge this aspect of Nietzsche's thought, even if it's uncomfortable. It's part of the whole picture. Okay, what about his critique of politics?
Yeah, he wasn't a fan of any of the major systems, was he?
Nope. He criticized both monarchies and democracies. He saw monarchies as often being too focused on the military and hereditary power, and democracies, he thought, were too easily swayed by what he called the inert herd.
So not exactly a fan of the masses?
No, not really. And instead, he proposed this idea of a Dionysian anarchy, which sounds kind of crazy at first.
Yeah, anarchy doesn't exactly scream stability and order.
Right, but Mencken clarifies that Nietzsche wasn't talking about lawlessness in the usual sense. What he imagined was a system where the most capable individuals, the strongest and most efficient, would naturally rise to the top and wouldn't be held back by rules or laws.
So it's more about a natural hierarchy based on ability.
Exactly. Okay, let's touch on his ideas about truth. Because he was really interested in the pursuit of knowledge, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. So how did he view truth?
Well, Mencken explains that Nietzsche didn't see truth as some fixed, objective thing that's just out there waiting to be discovered. Instead, he saw it as something we have to actively pursue. Through questioning, challenging assumptions, being willing to change our minds, he really valued critical thinking over dogma.
Because it's a process, not a destination.
Exactly. Finally, let's talk about his ideas on conscience and guilt. Where did he think those feelings came from?
Yeah, how did he explain that?
Well, Mencken summarizes Nietzsche's view as basically the old will to power turned inward. He argued that as civilization developed, we had to internalize a lot of our instincts, our natural drives, especially our drive for power and self-assertion, and that internalization led to guilt, to a bad conscience.
So it's like we're constantly policing ourselves according to these internalized societal norms. Interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating perspective. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've really delved into some complex ideas.
But I think that's what makes Nietzsche so compelling, so relevant. He challenges us to think differently about, well, almost everything.
Exactly. And his emphasis on self-overcoming, on embracing that will to power as that drive for growth and self-creation, those are ideas that continue to resonate today.
So for everyone listening, here's a final thought to ponder. Think about how Nietzsche's ideas might apply to your own life. What truths might you want to re-examine? What aspects of your life would you want to live over and over again if you had the choice?
This deep dive has really just been a starting point. There's so much more to explore in Nietzsche's work, and we encourage you to do just that, to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing yourself to think differently.
Exactly. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.